Our mission was simply to locate an abandoned ancient temple deep in the mountains. But after stepping into this forest, we discovered that the laws of physics here had completely broken down. The air seemed to hide invisible things, while a tremendous force above the treetops was pulling everything on the ground upward. Cooper's face was being tugged upward by something unseen. His lips peeled back first, exposing his gums. Then his entire cheek was lifted as if an invisible hand had grabbed his skin and yanked it toward the sky. His face was distorted beyond recognition, his features twisted together as if caught by an invisible iron hook. I heard his bones begin to crack. How can I describe that sound to you? It was like stepping into a pile of dry twigs, all snapping and shattering, but muffled inside flesh. Starting from his toes, moving upward, ankles, knees, pelvis, one joint after another. His tactical belt snapped with a bang. The magazines in his pouch flattened, and brass bullets squeezed out one by one from the crushed metal, shooting vertically into the sky, scraping past the brim of my steel helmet, clinking like rain falling upside down. Cooper tried to scream. His Adam's apple had already risen to his chin, his mouth wide open, but the sound from his throat was a gurgling, watery noise. Blood seeped from the pores of his neck, then detached from his skin and floated upward. Those droplets of blood rose to the height of my forehead, hovered for a beat, and continued flying into the pitch-black canopy. By now, his entire body had begun to lift off the ground. His boots slipped off from the toes, left behind in the muddy ground of the outpost. Then his pants, the legs already empty, his calves pulled out of the pant legs, suspended at the height of my shoulders. He still had a breath left, his twisted fingers desperately clawing at the air. But his fingernails peeled off one by one. His entire body became a piece of meat hooked on a hook, his gear digging into his armpits and crotch, holding his bones in place, preventing his body from flying away entirely. Cooper ended up suspended in the air in several pieces. His body was stretched to its limit by the invisible force, snapping into two halves mid-air. Throughout the entire process, not even half the scream escaped. The jungle was deathly silent, even the faintest insect chirps gone. Only my sandbag barricade sank 3 inches under some unseen pressure, sand squeezing out from the seams with a hissing sound. That was all the sound there was. A machine gunner turned into pieces hanging in the trees above, the jungle quiet as if nothing had happened. I stared at what remained of Cooper, hanging from the branches, not even swaying. There was no sound around. The jungle had never been this quiet. Our squad consisted of 6 people, part of a unit with a long name no one would recognize. The mission sounded simple: penetrate the highlands of Laos, find an ancient temple the North Vietnamese used for supplies, mark its coordinates, and call in an airstrike to destroy it. The helicopter dropped us in this ironwood forest with plans to pick us up in 5 days. The first 2 days were spent walking. The ironwood forest was absurdly dense, the canopy layered upon itself, light filtering down as scattered green dots. Sergeant Sanchez led the way, clearing a path with a machete. Cooper carried the machine gun in the middle. I followed behind him, carrying the radio and medical kit. Kowalski was behind me, and Ramirez brought up the rear. Lieutenant Pratt walked second, holding the map and compass. That afternoon, I noticed the first strange thing. I stopped to drink water, unscrewed the canteen cap, and the water inside tilted to one side, bulging toward the opening as if trying to break free, its surface taut. I tilted the canteen back and forth, but the water wouldn't level. I looked up at the trees. A dead branch hung vertically in mid-air, about knee-high off the ground, suspended. No wind, no insects, it just stayed there, not falling. I stared for over 10 seconds, making sure I wasn't seeing things. I called Lieutenant Pratt over. He glanced at it and said it was a visual refraction caused by heat waves. He also told me to tighten my body armor, saying I'd been too tense lately. I tightened the straps of my tactical vest. The ceramic plate on my chest felt heavy, heavier than usual. At the time, I thought I was just too tired. We walked for 3 more hours, and the ancient temple came into view. It was built of stone, very old, the carvings on the walls eaten away by vines. leaving only faint outlines of faces. In the clearing in front of the temple, bodies lay scattered. They were North Vietnamese soldiers, 7 or 8 of them. Their gear was strewn everywhere, guns still at their sides, but they were all dead. It was clear they hadn't died from gunfire. One soldier was embedded in a tree trunk. The Bodhi tree was so thick it would take 4 people to wrap their arms around it. About 40 feet up the trunk, his entire body was sunk into the wood, the bones of his back protruding from his uniform, fused with the bark. His face was flattened, nothing but a layer of skin stretched over his skull. Another one hung from the vines nearby. All the straps on his gear were torn, nylon webbing ripped apart by brute force. His face was as flat as the one embedded in the tree. Their rifles were still in place, their backpacks untouched. Only the men had been taken upward. Sergeant Sanchez crouched on the ground, examining their weapons. The bolts were pulled back, the rounds still chambered. The ceramic plates in their body armor. Each one was cracked, fractures radiating outward from the center as if crushed from within. Lieutenant Pratt ordered us to spread out and stay alert. His voice was hushed. Ramirez moved toward the back of the temple, while Kowalski crouched at the entrance, setting up the antenna. Cooper was beside me, mounting the machine gun on a stone pedestal, the barrel aimed at the canopy. As he set up, he whispered to me that something was off about this forest. There was something in the trees. Just as he said that, I looked down and saw a clear, sticky liquid seeping from the cracks between the stone slabs at the temple entrance. It oozed out like mucus, creeping slowly along the grooves of the stone. It had no smell, but it made the air around it tremble like heat rising from asphalt. I crouched to get a closer look. Before my fingers could touch the liquid, Lieutenant Pratt called my name from behind, ordering me to check the structure inside the temple. I stood up. At the moment my fingers were closest to the liquid, about 2 inches away, the skin on my fingertips suddenly sagged, as if the flesh itself had grown heavier and was being pulled downward. I jerked my hand back. Then I heard Ramirez shout from behind the temple. It wasn't loud, more like half a breath, cut off as if someone had clamped a hand over his mouth. Before that half breath could fade, I was already sprinting toward the back of the temple. Cooper, on my left, cursed something I couldn't make out as he manned the machine gun. Sergeant Sanchez moved in from the temple entrance, rifle leveled, the muzzle tracking my path. As I rounded the corner of the temple, I saw Ramirez kneeling on the ground. But his posture was all wrong. He was being forced down by something from above, driven into the mud. His knees were already buried, his body twisted at a horrifying angle in midair, his chest crushed flat by an invisible force. The sickening sound of bones cracking echoed all around him. The straps of his backpack were pulled taut, lifting his entire body upward. His spine groaned and snapped under the strain. Ramirez reached out, clawing at the trunk of a nearby tree. His right hand dug into a crack in the bark, gripping it desperately. Then I watched as his arm began to stretch, his hand still clinging to the tree, the joints between his elbow and shoulder pulling apart. He held on with everything he had, but the force dragging him upward shredded his fingers into a bloody mess until they finally slipped free in despair. His body flew upward, collapsing under its own weight as it rose. His ribs caved inward, his entire chest folding in on itself, forming a bowl-like hollow. The ceramic plate in his tactical vest shattered with a sharp crack, breaking into pieces that fell from the vest, only to stop midair at knee level before shooting back upward, grazing the edge of my helmet and disappearing into the dark canopy above. Cooper opened fire. The roar of the M60 machine gun tore through the jungle, the muzzle flash illuminating the clearing behind the temple. The bullets, however, began to curve upward about 5 meters around Ramirez. I saw the tracer rounds clearly, fired straight, but once they entered that space, they were guided upward by an invisible hand, arcing in orange-red streaks that brushed past Ramirez's body and vanished into the canopy. Even the bullet holes in the tree trunks were strange. The bark around them peeled outward, the wood inside splintering radially, as if the bullets had been fired from within. Sergeant Sanchez sprayed the canopy with his rifle, shouting as he fired, demanding to know what we saw. I yelled back that I couldn't see anything, nothing at all. Lieutenant Pratt was at the temple entrance, shouting into the radio, his voice drowned out by gunfire. I could only make out the words, "Where's the enemy?" repeated over and over. Kowalski leaned out from the temple entrance, firing his carbine into the air. He'd only gotten off 3 rounds before his rifle jammed. He tried to work the bolt, but it was stuck fast. The moment he looked down at his weapon, his helmet jerked upward, the chin strap tightening around his throat and lifting him 3 inches off the ground, his toes barely touching the dirt. He frantically unclipped the strap, and the helmet shot into the darkness, thudding against a tree. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. Ramirez had now risen to a height where I had to crane my neck to see him. His body continued to be flattened. Broken ends of ribs pierced through from under his armpits, pressing against the sleeves of his uniform and forming 2 sharp protrusions. His jawbone had dislocated from the temporomandibular joint, his entire lower jaw hanging slack, mouth gaping wider than his face, yet no sound emerged. The bones around his vocal cords were completely shattered. With one final acceleration, he was dragged into the dense foliage of the treetop. Leaves rustled violently, and then a viscous fluid, tinged with a faint pink, dripped down through the gaps in the leaves, pattering onto the stone floor of the temple. The gunfire ceased. Cooper fumbled with a new ammunition belt, his fingers trembling so badly he couldn't feed it into the feed tray. Sergeant Sanchez crouched beside me, reloading his magazine while muttering, "Oh God," under his breath, over and over. Lieutenant Pratt was still shouting into the radio when suddenly only static hissed from it, sharp and grating. I looked up at the treetop then and saw something. Where Ramirez had been dragged in, the leaves were stirring. Something thick was slowly writhing behind them. I couldn't see it entirely, only a segment. How thick was it? As thick as a tree trunk. Its surface was wet, pitch black and glossy, densely covered with bristles, each as long as a finger, stiff and protruding. It crept along a thick branch, the bristles scraping against the bark with a sound like sandpaper grinding wood, a muffled, rasping noise. Then it stopped. Beneath the bristles, its skin was pocked with thousands of tiny pores, like the holes in a sponge, opening and closing rhythmically. Each time they opened, a clear, viscous fluid oozed out, flowing down the bristles before dispersing into the air, forming a shimmering, transparent wave of heat. When I looked through that air, the scenery beyond twisted and warped, as if viewed through a sheet of red-hot iron. Cooper finally managed to seat the ammunition belt. He stood up, shouldered the machine gun, and fired into the treetop. Shell casings flew from the ejection port, but their trajectory was wrong. They ejected from the bolt, arced outward, then abruptly curved upward, tinkling as they flew vertically into the air, exactly like the bullets when Cooper had been dragged away earlier. Cooper cursed and kept firing. The bullets tore into the treetop, into the leaves surrounding that black appendage, snapping a thick branch. The branch fell, but slowed halfway, hovering in mid-air for a moment before continuing its descent and crashing onto the temple roof with a thunderous roar, shattering tiles in all directions. The appendage retracted, not quickly, but slowly, withdrawing upward until it vanished behind the leaves. The foliage closed back together, leaving nothing visible. The jungle fell silent again, so quiet I could hear my own teeth chattering. Sergeant Sanchez grabbed my shoulder and dragged me back behind the temple door. His fingers dug into the shoulder strap of my tactical vest. He told me to watch the temple roof. Watch the roof. Don't look up. I raised my eyes to the main hall's stone ceiling, where new cracks had appeared on the beams, radiating outward from the center, stone dust drifting down in fine streams. The entire temple stone floor was now seeping that same clear, viscous fluid, bubbles rising from the seams between the stones. Glug, glug, each swelling and bursting, the liquid spreading across the ground. Outside the temple entrance, Ramirez's rifle still lay where it had fallen. The M16 was on the ground, its stock cracked, the body coated in a sticky, transparent fluid that reflected a faint glimmer of sky. Beside it, the muddy ground bore a shallow depression, pressed by something, an irregular shape, like the imprint of a human torso in the mud. Cooper crouched beside me, panting, He propped his machine gun on the stone threshold of the temple door, the barrel aimed toward the treetop, his fingers still on the trigger. He turned to look at me, his lips moving soundlessly. Lieutenant Pratt leaned against the temple wall, clutching the radio handset, his knuckles white. The radio continued to emit static, interspersed with intermittent, sharp screeches, asterisk scree, scree asterisk, like something screaming through the electric current. Sergeant Sanchez aimed his rifle at the stone floor just outside the temple entrance, where the fluid continued to seep, now reaching the threshold. As the liquid touched the stone, the surface began to change color, shifting from bluish gray to a wet, dark black, then bubbling with fine, dense bubbles rising from within the stone itself. Sergeant Sanchez pulled us to the innermost corner of the temple hall, his back pressed against the stone wall, his rifle trained on the entrance. He kept speaking, his voice low and rapid. He said this thing was a secret weapon of the North Vietnamese. We had walked into an ambush. He said he once saw an industrial electromagnet in Da Nang, mounted on a Soviet-made helicopter capable of lifting a jeep off the ground. He insisted there must be one hidden in the treetops. The North Vietnamese had set it up on an ironwood branch, powered by a generator. As he spoke, he stripped off all the metal on his person, magazines, grenades, bayonet, belt buckle, even tearing off his dog tags from around his neck, piling them into a small heap on the ground. He said the less metal, the safer. That thing only attracted metal. Lieutenant Pratt leaned against the wall without speaking, his eyes fixed on the stone beams of the temple roof. The cracks in the beams had widened slightly, and stone dust continued to fall, landing on his helmet with a faint rustle. Kowalski crouched beside him, disassembling his jammed rifle for inspection. The bolt was stuck, sealed by something, and wouldn't budge. Kowalski ran his fingers over it, and when he pulled them away, a strand of transparent mucus stretched from his fingertips to the rifle, a thin, trembling thread hanging in the air. Cooper rearranged the sandbags pile between him and me. We had carried these sandbags into the temple as barricades when we entered, and now they were stacked about a yard behind the temple door. He mounted the machine gun on top of the sandbags and loaded a fresh ammo belt. The belt was metal, and he didn't discard it. He told Sanchez that if they threw away the ammo belt, they'd have nothing to fight with. Sanchez said to keep the gun for now and worry about the ammo belt later. I removed the metal from my own gear. 4 or 5 magazines placed on the ground, 2 grenades beside them, my belt pulled off and tossed into the corner. I didn't remove the body armor. It was ceramic with no metal. After shedding the gear, I felt much lighter, but my boots stuck to the stone floor with each step. The transparent mucus had already spread across the floor, making a soft, sticky sound as I lifted my feet. The mucus kept oozing from the seams between the stone slabs, bubbles swelling one after another from the cracks. They grew to the size of a thumbnail before bursting, the liquid spreading from the rupture as new bubbles formed nearby. The entire temple floor was bubbling, every stone seam continuously active. There was no smell in the air, but when I looked outside of the trees, the scenery seemed to waver gently. The outlines of the trunks blurred as if submerged in water. Sergeant Sanchez said it would be better at dawn. The helicopters would come at first light. We just had to hold out until then. He took off his watch. Its case was metal, and placed it on top of the pile of metal objects. The watch was still ticking, the second hand jumping steadily. On the 9th tick, I heard a scraping sound from the temple roof. Slow and heavy, like someone dragging a soaked, thick rope slowly across the tiles. The sound started directly above the temple hall, shifted to the left about 5 or 6 yards, and stopped. Then came 2 short, sharp scrapes, as if the rope were testing the tiles' weight-bearing capacity. From beneath the tiles came faint cracking sounds, the kind made when tiles are internally fractured but not yet broken. Cooper slowly raised the machine gun barrel toward the ceiling, aiming overhead. Lieutenant Pratt finally spoke, his voice low, saying electromagnets don't crawl. Sergeant Sanchez suggested it might be the wind or monkeys. The lieutenant replied that monkeys aren't that heavy. Sanchez fell silent. Kowalski finally managed to remove the bolt. He held it up to his eyes, examined it, and handed it to me. The surface of the metal parts was corroded with dense, tiny pits, as if sprayed with acid. Transparent liquid pooled at the bottom of the pits, still emitting fine bubbles. Kowalski said this thing was eating away at the steel. When I handed the bolt back to him, my fingers brushed against his. His fingertips were much colder than mine, icy to the touch, with a slight dampness on the skin. The skin on his fingertips seemed to sag ever so slightly, the same sensation I'd felt earlier when touching the liquid at the temple entrance. Sanchez kept talking, saying the electromagnet in Da Nang could lift 400 pounds, that North Vietnamese technology all came from the Soviets. As he spoke, he wiped at the mucus on the floor, trying to push it away from his feet. The mucus wouldn't budge. It parted under his fingers only to flow back when he lifted them. After 3 or 4 attempts, more and more liquid clung to the edges of his palms, and the skin between his fingers began to redden, as if scalded. The jungle outside the temple remained silent. No insects chirped, no birds called, not even the leaves rustled. But the thick thing on the roof moved again, this time not directly overhead, but toward the temple door. A tile slid from the eaves, shattered into pieces on the stone floor at the entrance. Kowalski's left hand began to float upward. He was crouched in the corner, fixing his rifle, both hands still resting on the mechanism. Suddenly, the back of his left hand flipped upward, as if pulled by invisible strings, his 5 fingers pointing straight up, knuckles cracking. He looked down at his hand, not understanding what was happening. Then his entire body was yanked upward from his crouch, the skin between his shoulders and neck stretched taut like a pale membrane, his feet lifting 2 inches off the stone floor, dangling and swaying. There was no metal on him. His dog tags were removed, his rifle placed on the ground, his belt taken off, even the metal eyelets on his boots were stripped away. Sanchez's electromagnet theory was pure bullshit, because Kowalski didn't have a single piece of iron on him, yet he was still floating. Kowalski began to rise, slowly pulled upward in jerks. The skin on the inside of his ankles, unable to bear his full weight, slid away from the bone, revealing the pale, glistening fascia tightly wrapped around it. There was no blood, just a wet, reflective sheen. He reached out to grab Lieutenant Pratt's shoulder beside him, his fingers digging into the fabric of the lieutenant's combat uniform, his nails turning white from the strain. Lieutenant Pratt grabbed him, both hands clamping onto Kowalski's wrists, leaning back, using his entire body weight to pull him down. The lieutenant's boots slipped on the slime-covered stone floor, squeaking, unable to gain any traction. Kowalski began to scream, the sound squeezed from his throat, thin and shrill, like a bird being strangled. His neck stretched, each vertebra straining against the next, the outline of his throat shifting downward beneath the skin, his collarbones protruding upward. His neck looked like a stretched rubber hose, the skin around his collar turning translucent. His combat uniform began to peel upward from the collar, the fabric being scraped off his skin layer by the force pulling him up. The sleeves slid off his arms, turning into 2 empty white tubes. His pants slid down from his waist, catching at the knees, leaving him dangling upward, held up by his own trousers. Lieutenant Pratt's grip on his wrist began to slip. Kowalski's wrist suddenly went limp and, slick with that strange slime, slid out of the lieutenant's tightly clenched hands. I was crouched behind the sandbag barricade, Cooper beside me, aiming his machine gun at the temple roof. I asked him if he was going to shoot, but he said he couldn't see a target. I called for Sanchez. Sanchez was slumped on the ground next to the pile of metal objects he had personally removed, his eyes fixed on Kowalski floating upward, mouth agape, but silent. His hands fumbled on the ground for his rifle, found it, then let go, his fingers too weak to pull the trigger. Kowalski rose to the height of the temple dome. His body began to flatten under its own weight. His pelvis gave out first, both hip bones folding inward from the sides, making a sound like wet firewood being snapped, crack after crack in rapid succession. The crushing pressure twisted his body into a grotesque shape, bones emitting a sickening, grinding noise. His ribcage collapsed next, ribs caving in one by one from top to bottom, his sternum sinking into a concave pit. Broken ribs pierced through from under his armpits, tearing through the seams of his combat uniform. The crack in the temple roof's beam exploded the moment his body touched the stone ceiling. The stone was crushed from the inside out, splitting into dozens of fragments that rained down onto the stone floor. Kowalski's body continued to rise, dragged through the hole in the temple roof tiles. Tiles shattered around him, revealing the black sky above. Looking up from inside the temple, the hole showed a few stars in the shadow of a writhing black appendage. Kowalski's carbine was still on the ground. The rifle was soaked through with that transparent slime, its metal surface no longer black but a mass of purplish-red rust. The plastic stock had shattered into pieces, exposing the metal skeleton inside, already rusted and broken. The fractured ends were a fresh reddish-brown, still hissing with tiny bubbles. Sergeant Sanchez finally got up from the ground. He stared at the hole in the temple roof and muttered, "Wrong, wrong. Not an electromagnet. Not metal." He turned to look at me, his eyes unfocused. He raised his rifle, aiming at the temple entrance, then lowered it again. He didn't know where to aim. Lieutenant Pratt crouched on the ground, hands spread open, covered in Kowalski's skin. He tried wiping them on his combat pants, but it wouldn't come off. The wet layer of skin clung to his palms like glue, stuck in the lines of his hands. Then, new movement came from outside the hole in the temple roof. That appendage descended from the edge of the breach. It was as thick as my waist, covered in dense bristles over its pitch-black skin, with countless tiny pores scattered between them. Those pores opened and closed rhythmically, revealing pink flesh inside each time they gaped, and with every opening, fluid squeezed outward. Droplets of mucus fell, stretching into thin strands as they descended through the air, landing on the stone floor of the temple. The mucus already pooled in the floors seems reacted to the new fluid, bubbling even faster. The entire stone floor now resembled a pot of slowly heating water, with small bubbles rising everywhere. Cooper's machine gun roared. He stood up and fired a long burst at the appendage outside the hole in the roof. The bullets cut through the air, their trajectories still curving upward, but this time he aimed close enough that several rounds struck the edge of the appendage, exploding amidst the bristles. The black skin split, and mucus gushed from the tears, flooding out in far greater quantities than the earlier seepage from the pores. Upon contact with the air, the mucus hissed and dispersed into a cloud of white smoke, which drifted upward to the tiles. The tiles sizzled as they were corroded, their surfaces foaming with a thick, white froth. The appendage retracted. A low, resonant vibration echoed from outside the breach, shaking the entire tree. Fine sand squeezed from the seams of the temple's stone walls, humming with the tremor. Cooper shifted position, moving 2 yards to the left and leaning against a stone pillar as he loaded a fresh ammo belt. He shouted to me, saying he'd hit it and that the thing could be hurt. He pressed the stock firmly against his shoulder and fired another burst through the hole in the roof. Lieutenant Pratt stood up and pulled Sanchez behind the sandbag barricade. The lieutenant's pant legs were soaked in mucus, the fabric hissing as it thinned, revealing the leg hair beneath. He scraped the mucus off with the back of his knife, and wherever the blade touched the fabric, it sliced through effortlessly like cutting tofu. Suddenly, the tree outside the temple shook violently. The ironwood canopy, with its trunk thick enough for several men to embrace, trembled from root to tip. The leaves shuddered collectively, as if electrified. Sergeant Sanchez began smashing things. He first picked up his rifle from the ground, gripping it by the barrel and swinging it like an axe against the stone wall. The stock cracked on the first blow, and on the second, it broke clean off the rifle and flew away, striking Lieutenant Pratt's helmet before bouncing off and rolling into the puddle of mucus in the corner. The wooden stock soaked in the mucus, hissing as tiny bubbles formed, its fibers slowly separating and floating to the surface. Sanchez didn't stop. He kept smashing until the barrel bent, and the bolt flew out, striking his own cheekbone and leaving a white mark without breaking the skin. He threw the L-shaped rifle to the ground, bent over, and scooped up the pile of metal he'd earlier stacked in the corner. Magazines, grenades, bayonets, belt buckles, dog tags, and hurled it all toward the temple entrance. The metal objects clattered and scattered across the stone floor, and one magazine discharged upon impact with a bang, sending a bullet sideways into the stone pillar of the temple door, spraying stone fragments into my face. His curses were fragmented, incoherent. Sanchez had completely broken down, hysterically swearing. He frantically smashed the remaining gear on his body onto the ground. When there was nothing left to throw, he drew the entrenching tool from his waist and began hacking at the mucus oozing from the seams in the stone floor. With each chop, mucus splattered onto his face, but he didn't wipe it away, just kept hacking. The blade of the tool dulled and curled, leaving white marks on the stone, while the mucus continued to bubble, gurgling rhythmically, unchanged. Cooper leaned against the stone pillar, reloading his ammo belt. His fingers were steady now, his movements faster than before. He fed the belt into the feed tray, racked the bolt, pressed the stock to his shoulder, and fired 2 more shots through the hole in the roof. The bullets struck the appendage outside, severing a few bristles from its edge. The bristles drifted down, swirling lazily through the breach before landing exactly where Kowalski had been crouching earlier. As long as a finger and gleaming black, they immediately began to corrode upon touching the mucus, softening from the tips, curling, and emitting a wisp of white smoke. Lieutenant Pratt saw Sanchez hacking at the floor and went to pull him away. The lieutenant grabbed Sanchez's shoulder with one hand, yanking him backward, while his other hand reached for the entrenching tool. Sanchez turned and swung the tool horizontally. Pratt dodged backward, the blade grazing his chin and breaking the skin, leaving a faint red line that oozed blood. The lieutenant let go and retreated 3 steps, his back hitting the stone pillar of the temple door. He looked at Sanchez, his eyes no longer seeing one of his own men, but a problem that needed to be dealt with. Then Lieutenant Pratt did something. He drew his pistol from its holster at his waist, aiming it at Sanchez's thigh. Cripple him, drag him back, and he might still be saved. His index finger rested on the trigger, beginning to apply pressure. Cooper shouted beside me, telling the lieutenant not to shoot. The lieutenant didn't look at Cooper. His eyes remained fixed on Sanchez's face. Sanchez had crouched down by now, squatting in the thickest part of the slime on the ground. The fabric of his combat pants below the knees was already eaten through in several places by the mucus, revealing purplish-red skin on his knees. He gripped a dented entrenching tool, its blade scraping back and forth against the stone floor as if sawing through air. Then the temple roof began to collapse. The tiles around the edges of the breach shifted. Those tiles, along with the underlying plaster layer, peeled away in whole sections, exposing the stone beams beneath. The crack in the center beam had been widening since earlier and now expanded enough for me to see the iron reinforcement inside. The metal rusted rapidly, turning from bluish-gray to orange-yellow and then reddish-brown. All within the few seconds I looked up. Rust flaked off the surface of the reinforcement in layers, like sunburned skin, drifting downward. Large sections of the stone ceiling split apart near the breach. A long fissure ran from the center of the dome all the way to the stone lintel above the temple entrance. Stone dust sprayed from the crack, and the fine lime carried by the airflow filled my nostrils. Outside the temple, the tree shook again. This time, the entire trunk twisted outward, pulling several of the thickest roots from the soil. Dirt cascaded from the roots, revealing the rock beneath. Where the roots had been uprooted, mucus gushed from the stone crevices, spraying out like a burst pipe. Then I saw more of the thing descending through the breach. 3 appendages, each as thick as a waist, covered in bristles and fleshy pores, squeezed in from 3 different directions outside the hole. The middle one was the same appendage Cooper had wounded earlier, its torn edge still oozing mucus that dripped down the bristles. The 2 on either side were new, unharmed, their bristles neatly aligned as they probed downward along the temple walls. The 3 appendages converged in midair inside the temple. At the point where they met, a larger spongy structure bulged, a tangled mass like a huge sponge, with thousands of tiny pores opening and closing in all 4 directions. With each pulse, the air in the temple trembled. Small stones on the stone floor, shell casings, and parts that had fallen from Kowalski's rifle all vibrated, clattering against each other with a low hum. Cooper fired half a belt of ammunition into the spongy mass. Every bullet sank into the fleshy pores. From the outside, you could see the pores swell open as the bullets entered, then close, swallowing them whole. But none of the bullets exited the other side. The spongy structure was too thick. The rounds were trapped within the flesh, causing the entire mass to shudder, its surface bulging in egg-sized lumps. Then the bullets were forced back out. The swallowed rounds were pushed back through the same entry holes, coated in clear mucus, and slowly fell to the stone floor. The bullets were deformed, flattened into small copper discs by the flesh. Lieutenant Pratt holstered his pistol. He slid it back into the holster on his hip, turned, walked behind the sandbag barricade, and pulled me up. His lips were moving, but with Sanchez still smashing something behind us, I couldn't make out the words. He leaned close to my ear and shouted, "Get the thermite. We're blowing the roof." The word thermite sent a chill down my spine. Yes, we had thermite, 2 canisters originally meant to destroy the radio and code books if we were ambushed and the mission failed. The radio was already ruined by the mucus, and the code books were still in Kowalski's pocket. Kowalski's body hung from the treetop, out of reach. The thermite was still in my backpack. I crouched and rummaged through my pack. The inner layer was half soaked in mucus, and the synthetic fabric had already begun to break down. My hand brushed against the 2 hard thermite grenade canisters, their surfaces cold to the touch. I pulled them out and saw the metal cans covered in fine beads of moisture, like sweat. I hooked one onto each side of my tactical vest chest clips. The clips barely held, and the metal cans clanked against the ceramic plates of my body armor. Cooper's machine gun jammed. The ammunition belt had to pass through a feed guide before entering the chamber, but the guide was splattered with mucus, and the steel surface had rusted, causing the links to catch repeatedly. Cooper yanked the stuck links out by hand, splitting 2 of his fingernails. The cracked nail beds filled with rust particles. Just then, Sanchez stood up from the corner, holding something. He had picked up the last remaining item from the pile of metal parts he'd dismantled earlier, a wristwatch. The crystal was shattered, and the hands weren't moving. He pressed the watch against his forehead for a moment, then hurled it toward the 3 appendages on the temple roof. The watch traced a parabola through the air, not a gentle curve, but a sharp, upward trajectory, dragged into the intensified gravity zone. It accelerated and struck the spongy flesh with a dull thud. The watch sank into the mass, and dozens of tiny pores immediately swarmed around it, swallowing it whole. Then Sanchez began walking toward the temple door. Step by step, he moved from the corner to the entrance. Weaponless, his eyes fixed on the tree root outside the temple that was still spewing viscous fluid. Lieutenant Pratt leaped up from behind the barricade to chase after him. At that moment, a smaller appendage, thinner than the previous 3, about the size of an arm, descended from the broken opening above. It had been hidden in the upper trunk, and now extended sharply downward from beneath the temple's tiled eaves. Its tip lacked bristles, but was covered in fleshy pores, aimed directly at Sanchez's head as he strode forward. The moment Sanchez stepped out of the temple, the entire stone floor shuddered violently. Even crouched behind the barricade, I felt the stone beneath my feet jump an inch upward. The slime in the cracks of the stone slabs bubbled and gasped out in unison from the tremor. The sandstone surfaces of the pillars flanking the temple door began peeling away layer by layer, revealing the crumbly red brick core within. The mud Sanchez stepped onto was the kind of sludge saturated with that viscous fluid. His left foot sank in, the mire swallowing his ankle. He pulled it free and took another step forward, his boot stuck in the mud. The sound of his bare foot slapping onto the sludge was a wet squelch, and he kept walking. Just then, the thinner appendage descended directly above him. He watched it lower itself to his face and reached out to grab it. His fingers dug into the fleshy pores, and dozens of tiny holes immediately suctioned onto them, the fleshy walls tightening around his knuckles. His entire hand began to change color, from flesh tone to purple, then from purple to black. Lieutenant Pratt halted at the temple entrance. Cooper, beside me, yanked out the jammed ammunition belt and tossed it aside, a small pile of discarded links accumulating on the ground. Crouched behind the sandbags, I felt the 2 canisters of thermite against my chest plate, their chills seeping through my combat uniform into my skin. I watched Sanchez's figure grow smaller and smaller outside the temple, moving deeper into the area where uprooted tree roots and oozing sludge covered the ground. The thin appendage above him followed quietly, writhing silently over his head. Then I noticed something. Sanchez hadn't been dragged upward yet. Those fleshy pores had been suctioning his fingers for several seconds, but he remained standing on the ground. When Cooper had wounded the appendage earlier, the pores near the injured area had all clamped shut. Now, the pores gripping Sanchez's fingers were opening and closing rhythmically, opening and closing, as if they needed to close to breathe. In a half-breath, when the pores closed, the air around the appendage stopped trembling. The skin on Sanchez's fingers no longer sank into the pores when they clamped shut. I stared intently at the creature. The moment the pores closed, that eerie suction force vanished. It needed to breathe. This was our only way out. I tore the thermite canister from the right side of my chest, leaving the other on the left untouched. I stood up, vaulted over the sandbag barricade, and landed on the sticky stone floor. Cooper asked me what I was doing, but I didn't answer. Lieutenant Pratt turned to look at me, his mouth opening to give an order, but I was already past him, sprinting toward the temple entrance. I dashed out of the temple and plunged into the same sludge Sanchez had stepped into. The mire beneath my feet sucked at my boots with wet, squelching sounds. The thin appendage overhead was now just 3 yards ahead of me. Sanchez was still standing beneath it, his fingers still suctioned, his face as pale as paper. I ran in the same direction. I needed those pores to suction onto me the next time they opened. Then, during that half second when they closed to breathe, the sludge reached my calves. Every step required lifting my knee to my chest to pull free. The thin appendage above was only 3 yards away. I could see every fleshy pore at its tip. The edges were pale pink, surrounded by a ring of fine, twitching muscles. When the pores opened, I could see the bottomless channels inside, the fleshy walls coated with a layer of transparent slime. When they closed, the muscles tightened into small knots, and the surrounding skin wrinkled into radial patterns. Sanchez was 2 steps ahead of me. His hand was still on the appendage, all 10 fingers sucked into the fleshy pores. He turned his head to look at me, his expression as if he didn't recognize me. His lips moved, but the sound was drowned out by the rustling of leaves overhead. One of his legs was buried in the mud from the knee up, and the slime on the surface was crawling up his combat pants, corroding the fabric into a mesh of holes. The moment I charged into the gravity field, my feet were slammed downward. My ankle bones knocked together and my knees buckled. My entire spine compressed from top to bottom, vertebrae squeezing against one another. I heard my own back crackling, as if someone had dumped a sack of stones on my shoulders. The dog tags around my neck, plastic, not suction away, dug into the flesh at the back of my neck, their edges carving 2 bloody lines. My left hand instinctively swung upward, my fingers brushing against the boundary of the gravity field. It felt warm, like reaching a hand over a pot of boiling water that had just been taken off the heat. All the flesh pores on that slender appendage turned towards me, hundreds of tiny holes opening in unison. My left hand was the first to be sucked in. My fingers pressed together and were pulled upward, the knuckles popping in and out of their sockets, clicking rapidly and repeatedly. Blood seeped out from beneath all 5 fingernails at once, flowing upward along the nails and crawling into the flesh pores through the nail grooves. The skin of my wrist was pulled away from the bone, a pocket of air swelling beneath it, forming a small bulge that then slid up the back of my hand, stopping at the forearm and turning into a loose fold of skin hanging over the radius bone. The appendage lifted me upward, my left foot pulled free from the mud, the boot slipping off my heel and remaining in the mire. My bare sole touched the weighted air, the calluses flattening under the pressure, cracking into several hard patches that peeled back from the sole. My toenails were pried upward, the nail beds filling with clear fluid. My right hand clutched the thermite canister. The metal casing was being sucked inward by the weighted field, pressing into my palm. I could feel it deforming, the cylindrical shape slowly turning elliptical. The next pore closure was coming. When the appendage had sucked on Sanchez's finger earlier, it had closed for about half a breath before reopening. Half a breath, 2 seconds at most. The flesh pores opened to their fullest extent. The muscular walls beneath the appendage's skin writhed violently, contracting inward, visible through the openings as muscle fibers tensed one by one from a relaxed state. All the pores snapped shut simultaneously. The muscles around the openings twisted into knots like spasms, the surface texture shifting from circular dots to densely packed wrinkles. My body suddenly dropped. The weighted field vanished. My feet landed back in the mud, my spine rebounding from its compressed state, the vertebrae releasing with a sound like a series of tiny bubbles popping. My left hand remained stuck to the appendage, but my fingers were no longer being sucked inward. I raised the thermite grenade to my mouth, biting down on the safety pin and pulling it out. The metal ring scraped across my lips, breaking the skin, filling my mouth with the taste of iron. The safety lever sprang open. The internal fuse ignited, and a hissing stream of white smoke sprayed from the base of the canister, scalding my chin and searing a small patch of skin with a sizzle. With my left hand, I grabbed the largest cluster of closed pores on the appendage, digging my fingers into the spasming muscle crevices. Using the 2 seconds before the pores reopened, I shoved the thermite canister into the tightly shut openings with my right hand. The canister forced its way into the closed flesh pores. The muscular walls tore, forced open from their sealed state, dozens of muscle fibers snapping with sharp pops. Black fluid sprayed from the ruptures, coating my entire right hand. First a chill, then a burning pain as tiny white blisters immediately formed across the skin. I pushed with all my might, throwing my full weight forward until the canister sank and up to my wrist, enveloped by the surrounding flesh. The appendage shuddered violently. All the pores opened simultaneously, wider than I had ever seen, their channels stretching into perfect circles as the pink inner walls turned inside out, forming fleshy protrusions. My left hand slipped free from the cluster of open pores, and I fell backward into the mud. Then the top of my head seemed to explode. The thermite ignited inside the appendage, 3,000 degrees Celsius. White light shot out from the open pores, thousands of holes lighting up like lamps, turning the temple entrance bright as day. The light pierced through the appendage's outer skin, revealing an orange-white glow beneath the black surface, each bristle glowing orange before curling and charring away. The appendage's diameter instantly doubled, its skin stretched translucent by the internal heat. The muscle tissue inside turned gray, layer by layer, burning to powder and spraying out from the pores. The shockwave of the explosion traveled from the appendage to the trunk and into the ground. The ironwood tree at the temple entrance split from within, cracks racing upward from the roots. A crashing sound of breaking branches came from the canopy as the 3 thick appendages withdrew from the hole in the temple roof. No longer a slow crawl, but a frantic thrashing. The middle appendage, the one Cooper had wounded, scraped against the edge of the hole as it pulled back, tearing off a large chunk of stone and tiles that crashed onto the temple stone floor. The weighted field went haywire. The air outside the temple entrance shuddered in erratic bursts. Small stones on the muddy ground pattered down, only to be sucked back up half a beat later, bouncing in midair. My body alternated between lightness and heaviness, the pressure in my ears constantly shifting, eardrums bulging outward, then collapsing inward, then bulging again. The slender appendage I had stuffed with thermite snapped in half. The lower segment fell into the mud, still burning, the flesh walls charring outward from the break, forming a black cavity with bubbling inner walls. The upper half, still connected to the main body, jerked violently upward, disappearing into the foliage above. Then, something massive crashed down from directly above the canopy. The spongy, porous structure tore through the canopy and plummeted downward from the center of the treetop. It crashed onto the temple roof, smashing through the entire dome. Tiles, stone beams, and plaster layers collapsed inward, accompanied by a thunderous roar of destruction from inside the temple. The thick appendages, now unsupported, followed suit, falling from the canopy in heavy, segmented sections that crashed down around the temple. One appendage, as thick as my waist, landed in the mud just 3 steps away from me. The impact forced the mud to splatter outward, drenching me from head to toe. The limb was still moving, writhing and twitching in the mud like a decapitated snake, its bristles scraping deep, half-foot grooves into the ground. Cooper's machine gun continued to fire from inside the temple. His original position had been behind a sandbag emplacement, but with the roof collapsed, the sound of his gunfire had shifted, now coming from near the left stone pillar at the temple entrance. I saw him standing on a pile of rubble, one side of his face covered in stone dust. He was firing finishing shots into the thick, still writhing appendage on the ground. Shell casings ejected chaotically from the weapon, some flying straight, others tumbling erratically, a sign that the increased gravity field hadn't fully normalized yet. Lieutenant Pratt crawled out from the temple entrance, pulling one leg free from beneath the rubble, his pant leg mostly torn off. As he emerged, he dragged an M16 with him, Sanchez's rifle, now bent but still functional. He propped it on the remains of the temple's pillar base and fired upward into the tree. The canopy had begun to burn. The thermite had burned through the slender appendage and ignited part of the connected spongy mass, the intense heat setting fire to decades of accumulated dead leaves and branches within the ironwood treetop. Flames spread across the crown, their orange-red glow shining through the green foliage and illuminating the entire temple courtyard. In the firelight, I saw the creature in its entirety. The spongy mass at the center of the canopy was its core. 3 thick appendages branched out from it, wrapping around the ironwood's trunk and main branches in different directions, the thickest one embracing the trunk like a coil. Slender appendages split off from the thicker ones, at least a dozen of them, reaching out in all directions, some entwined with branches, others dangling midair. The surface of every appendage was covered in bristles and pores. Larger pores as wide as bowls, clustered at the center of the spongy mass, now spasming irregularly, opening and closing, opening and closing. A crater had been burned into the midsection of the spongy mass by the thermite, its edges still glowing with orange flames. The fire was spreading inward, turning the creature's black skin to gray, then white, before crumbling into ash that drifted downward. Inside the burned cavity, layered flesh structures were visible, each layer writhing and oozing mucus, but the fluid vaporized instantly upon contact with the flames, releasing acrid, acidic white smoke. The entire spongy mass convulsed violently, causing the thick appendage wrapped around the trunk to scrape off large sections of bark. Cooper reloaded a fresh belt and fired into the burned wound on the spongy mass. This time, the bullets weren't swallowed, they struck the exposed inner flesh within the cavity. Each impact burst with dark green fluid that sprayed onto the trunk, hissing and smoking. Lieutenant Pratt's M16 rang out as well, joining Cooper in targeting the cavity. Their crossfire riddled the wound. The spongy mass began to detach from the tree, the thickest appendage loosening its grip and sliding downward. Then, the entire structure broke free from the canopy, crashing through multiple layers of branches, each impact accompanied by the sound of snapping wood. The colossal entity slammed into the muddy ground in front of the temple, sending waves of mud splashing outward. The spongy mass lay face up in the muck, still twitching, its appendages thrashing and rolling across the ground, flinging debris in all directions. The pores that had once sucked people into the sky now gaped open, spewing mucus in gushing streams that arced upward before splattering back onto the creature's own body, coating it layer by layer. I crawled forward through the mud towards Sanchez. He lay on the ground, his face covered in filth. The skin on his hand, which had been sucked by one of the pores, was completely stripped away, exposing finger bones between tattered flesh. But he was still breathing, his chest rising and falling. Cooper's machine gun fell silent. The barrel had overheated, glowing red, and could no longer fire. Lieutenant Pratt's rifle also went quiet. He was out of ammunition. The fire continued to burn across the spongy mass, spreading outward from beneath it and igniting the mucus seeping into the ground. Small clusters of flames dotted the temple courtyard. The pores at the center of the spongy structure slowed their movements, the openings growing smaller and smaller until they froze halfway open. The appendages ceased their convulsions, lying limp and segmented in the mud. The firelight flickered across its black skin, each bristle starkly visible. The weight field was completely gone. The trembling in the air had ceased entirely. The slime in the cracks of the stone slabs no longer bubbled. A sudden snap echoed from the jungle around the temple entrance. Insects had begun to chirp. The sound of crickets rose from the distant thickets behind me, followed by the croaking of frogs, and then the call of some bird from the treetops. I lay in the mud, the second remaining canister of thermite pressed against the hollow of my sternum on my left side. The bare sole of my foot was covered in sand and gravel. I glanced at the massive burning creature ahead. It had stopped moving. Then I looked toward the temple entrance. Cooper crouched beside the base of stone pillar, having already unclipped his canteen from his belt to pour water over the machine gun barrel. The water hissed into steam as it met the scorching metal. Lieutenant Pratt leaned against the broken pillar, lowering his rifle's muzzle as he touched the shallow red cut on his chin left by Sanchez's shovel tip. Half the temple had collapsed, and the remaining roof was still shedding fragments of stone. The sporadic sound of sliding tiles mingled with the insect chorus. At dawn, I woke up. Everything around me was mud. My left leg throbbed with excruciating pain, the lower half twisted at an unnatural angle, barely able to bear weight. The bone was coated in dried mud, a dull gray brown. My left foot was bare, the calluses torn away to reveal raw, pink flesh beneath, embedded with gravel and splinters. Cooper crouched beside me. His canteen was empty, the gun barrel resting on a pile of rubble. He reached out and dragged me from the mud, propping me against the broken pillar by the temple entrance. Neither of us made a sound as he pulled me. Lieutenant Pratt stood at the temple entrance, helping Sanchez to his feet. Sanchez's palm was wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from his combat uniform, already soaked through with the fluid seeping from his fingers. His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at anyone. The lieutenant used 2 cleaning rods and a roll of tape to bind Sanchez's arm to his torso, keeping his hand pressed against his chest. The rods had been picked up from the ground, no telling whose rifle they'd come from. I pushed myself up from the pillar, unable to put weight on my left leg. I looked down at my chest. 1 canister of thermite remained, clipped to the left side, its body dented. I unclipped it and set it at the base of the pillar. In the clearing before the temple entrance, the spongy mass had stopped moving. Its skin had burned from black to ashen gray. The scorched areas split open like cracks in dried riverbed mud. No more slime oozed from the fissures, just dry, charred tissue. The fine appendages were either broken or curled, sprawled across the mud. Around it, the bristles that had once covered its body still jutted from the ground here and there, blackened and stiff. Cooper slung the machine gun over his shoulder, its body caked in dried mud and stone dust. Lieutenant Pratt hoisted Sanchez on his back, Sanchez's bare feet dragging in the dirt. I picked up a thick branch to use as a crutch. We began making our way out of the jungle. As we passed the Bodhi tree beside the temple, the bullet holes in its trunk remained. Ramirez's finger skin still clung to the bark, dried now, 5 pale gray strips embedded in the grooves. At the base of the tree lay his boot, half buried in the mud, its opening pointing skyward. The fire in the canopy had died. Thin wisps of white smoke rose from the charred branches, mingling with the morning mist. We didn't look for Kowalski. The trees overhead were too tall. After about 50 yards, the insect chorus suddenly swelled. From all directions came chirps, croaks, the desperate cries of countless creatures. The jungle had come alive, deafeningly loud. Cooper walked ahead of me, the machine gun barrel swaying behind his shoulder, shedding chunks of mud with each movement. Lieutenant Pratt led the way, Sanchez's head bobbing against his shoulder. I brought up the rear, hobbling on my branch. With every hop, The protruding bone in my left leg brushed against the fabric of my pants, rustling faintly. I didn't look back.